afternoon, everyone. It's always good to be at an AWEI event, and it's great to see so many familiar faces. Frank, I don't know if I can speak to whether the insects understand the law, but I can speak a little bit to how the law, at least in my understanding of it, understands insects and why there's a bit of a problem with how the law is currently looking at insects. So a bit of background, I'm typically in international trade, agricultural products mostly, but I've done some work with AWEI in wildlife meat or wild meat. And in December, I went home to Zimbabwe, and my dad, who's a farmer, is a much better researcher than I am. And he was telling me all about earthworms and black soldier fly, and he was trying to trap black soldier flies and that kind of thing, and talking about their, usefulness as a alternative protein, which got the nerd in me thinking, well, this thing of insects being traded, what's the story? What's the law saying about this? Is the law dealing with this adequately? And so I had hoped to have a couple of easy answers, and it turns out the more I've been reading about this, the more I've been looking at the law, the less answers I really have, and the more questions I have. So I've come to share with you today quite a lot of my questions and a couple of observations that I have. So does the law understand insects? The short answer is no, not really, but it's more complicated than that. So fortunately, I didn't fly from Joburg today to just come and say no and sit down again. That might be a relief to some and a disappointment to others. But yeah, so this research very much originated in practical conversation, and I think that's how a lot of research does originate, is in conversations with people in industries different to yours. And as someone in law, I'm very cognizant of that, and which is exactly why I also enjoy interdisciplinary weeks such as this one with AWEI today. So why is it a bit more complicated? My question always comes back to, well, let's start at the law. What does the law say? And my first hurdle was in the definitions within legislation. So I started looking at your typical legislation in South Africa, Agricultural Pests Act, National Environmental Management Act, that type of thing, and trying to understand, well, when we talk about insects, because lawyers, we love to define things, how are we defining insects? And what was really striking to me is insects aren't really intentionally introduced into our legislation. They're there intentionally as pests, specifically pests to agriculture. And this got me reading more and more and more about, okay, well, what are the different uses of insects? I'm sure there's people in this room that have a lot more of a scientific grasp on what the use of insects are. But for me, legally, as someone that focuses in my mostly international trade part of my life on agricultural products and sanitary and phytosanitary measures, so the measures that ensure that pests aren't transported across borders or aren't introduced into areas where they aren't endemic or already exist and that type of thing. This got me thinking, because with statistics of about 2 billion people consuming insects, there being about 500 edible insect species in Southern Africa, and with a lot of authors writing about insects from the lens of them being mini livestock, I really had to ask the question, but how do we see insects? Because the law is really not seeing it as mini livestock, it's seeing it as a pest, as opposed to something that can also be affected by pests, even though the pests might also be other insects. And then when I speak of pests, it's not just other insects, it's fungus that they carry, it's viruses that they carry, that type of thing. So it's a really interesting field to currently be in, to be researching. But a couple of interesting observations are that bees are always, not always, but very often focused on as being kind of something separate from insects. So you'll have insect defined as something that can affect plants or that can destroy plants, usually in that context. And then there will be a definition of apiary equipment and potentially a definition of honey. My assumption is that the law sees these as separate things because of potentially the commercial value of honey, and it's also a more mainstream traded product. So my colleague Tariro spoke about mopani worms. This is typically the type of product that I am more worried about than whether or not honey is safely moving across borders, because insects are not just, as I said, not just a pest problem. You've got concerns about aflatoxin, you've got concerns about heavy metal traces in insects, that type of thing. They, just like any animal, any human, are also products of the environment from which they come. So if that environment isn't local for local consumption, a kind of consuming what you're expecting to consume, and it is something traded across a border, it becomes quite complicated and it becomes potentially risky. So a further step away from the wildlife economy is talking about the use of insects in biological control. So in my other life, I also look at, or research at least, the citrus industry, in which false codling moth, for example, is a reason why the EU has added additional restrictions to exports of citrus from South Africa. But within the systems approach that we use in South Africa, Zimbabwe uses it in different industries as well, in avocados, macadamias, whatever it might be. Insects are brought in to kill other insects in a much more sustainable, in that pesticides aren't being used. But with this comes some risk. And as a lawyer, I always want to know, well, what are the regulations? How are we mitigating this risk? And, that type of question. So some of my observations tie into these questions that I have. And data internationally is very scarce on what are the quantities of insects being traded. This is largely because we don't have HS codes that very clearly define insects. So insects might be a single code which is recorded, but if you've got 500 different species, 250 of them might broadly fall under one category, but their use is certainly not always the same. So for me, the focus should really be on different uses of insects as well, because consumption is one thing, animal feed is another thing, biological control is another thing, and research is another thing. But with subcategories underneath each one of those four broader categories of insects. So I've observed a number of unnecessary barriers plus risky trade. So I'm not the type of person in law that advocates for unnecessary barriers. I advocate for law that is logical and that is fit for purpose. And unfortunately, this is a general complaint that I have about agricultural law, especially related to sanitary and phytosanitary measures, is we do not have legislation fit for purpose. That's not a problem unique to South Africa, although our legislative framework is one of the more problematic ones. The Seychelles, for example, has a much less problematic sanitary and phytosanitary framework, as does Nigeria. Application, of course, is a different question. I'm just talking about what does the law look like. So with this comes a lot of unknowns, and that is an unknown for the wild economy too. Frank, I think earlier you spoke about, contextualizing the wild economy within the economy. They're not separate. In the same way that livestock being imported with disease affects the wild economy if that disease was to spread. The same thing with insects. If you picture them as mini livestock, just you can get a couple of thousand more in a Tupperware container than you can cows, it kind of contextualizes the risk as well. And so yeah, I wanted to share this with you to highlight some of the questions that I have in my ongoing research. And then, of course, to really highlight that my contribution in this, I'm not answering all the questions, I can't possibly, is to look at it from a lens of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, emphasizing safe trade, but safe trade not just being safe trade in the traditional sense that we understand it, but safe for insects as well, and safe for consumption, safe for biological control, for whatever it might be, but data and research based. I mean, I'm speaking to a room full of mostly researchers and data specialists, so that kind of goes without saying. But one thing that I would like to highlight is the World Trade Organization, which I'd initially thought would probably be the last place to have thought about insects, actually does, in the EC Biotech case, which was had something to do with GMO products and that kind of thing, commented on the status of insects. So insects are considered, at least by the World Trade Organization, as animals. So when we speak about the protection of human, animal, and plant life and health, it fits within that international framework that we've got, which is not all that we've got, but there aren't any real comprehensive legislative frameworks or international frameworks that give much guidance. So the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE, had a special series published on insect consumption, largely from a trade perspective, not so much from a food safety perspective, although highlighting some of the risks. And I get a lot of inspiration from that type of research. And yeah, I hope that a couple of you have questions that I can't answer so that I can make a note of them and go and try and find the answers. Yeah, I don't know when this will be published, but it's at least 2 papers that are, you know, quite close to at least having the first set of further questions contextualized into one paper. Thank you very much.